Welcome to the Things We Think and Do Not Say with Christina and Chad. Hello and welcome to the Things We Think and Do Not Say with Christina
and Chad.
So we're here today for another interesting topic, and so I'm going to let Chad get started.
So things we don't talk about in general, not just us. Actually, I think we talk about it more than most. Mental illness, so depression, anxiety, those types of things. There's a stigma that exists that we just can't talk about it, can't admit we have a problem. If we do, we're weird, we're unique, we're the oddball. All of those things, that stigma that goes with it. And I think it probably, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure you will, probably is more of a reflection of men than women. In terms of the stigma that goes, it's not manly if I admit I have a problem, or those sorts of things.
Yeah, there tends to be differences in gender, overall, due to gender stereotypes and expectations within our society. But there also tend to be differences between cultures, religions, and lots of other factors, age, and so hopefully we'll get into some of those different areas as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned religion. So part of seminary education, you do chaplaincy work. I did my chaplaincy in a level one trauma center in a behavioral health unit. So I chose that because I'm like, hey, my wife does mental health for professionally. It would be nice to kind of have something that could relate, sort of tie back. I was a psychology major at one time in college, and long story short, I changed that major after my abnormal psychology midterm. Oddly enough, when I realized doing my chaplaincy work was that I really didn't like the label piece. I liked helping people, but I didn't like the putting labels on. So while I was doing my chaplaincy work, there was a young man that was admitted to the behavioral health unit, essentially because his pastor told him to stop taking his meds. He just needed to pray and have faith, and all of his mental illness would go away. And then he landed in the behavioral health unit. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, there is this idea in some faith communities that seeking the assistance of man-made medications, created treatments, things like that, goes against spirituality, goes against faith, goes against their religious views and beliefs. And I think that one of the important things to remember is that spirituality, not specifically a religious doctrine, but spirituality overall and community within some kind of faith-based practice, can be amazing and can be incredibly helpful and supportive for individuals who do have mental illness, or maybe not even constitute mental illness, but have some mental wellness concerns. But that shouldn't be the only thing, right? One of the kind of opposing arguments as far as religion and faith is that, well, God created us with the ability and knowledge to create those medications and treatments and all of that, and so we should use it. That's part of the answer, right? Part of the answer to prayers. But some communities will take that to an extreme and say, well, prayer is the only way to get through this, and so if you're using these other things, then your faith is not strong enough.
Yeah. So the happy ending to that story, the young man's pastor came to visit him while he was there and walked in and said, "Oh my God, I had no idea this was a thing. Please start taking your medication again." And so I've said many times, I think that we have this belief that, as you mentioned, that God will take care of it. And you also mentioned, and I'm sure you learned this from me, God created on His own. God created creation in the beginning, and since then, God has created change through people and individuals. And I think that applies, therapy, medications, science, all those things that sort of apply. But yeah, we still have this stigma, and I love the way you put it. In conjunction with, faith community when it's operating the way it's supposed to operate, can be hugely supportive, and that support can help people along with other treatments depending on what's wrong. So you said something. I have a question. Mental illness versus mental wellness. What's the difference?
Typically, when we talk about mental illness, it's a diagnosable mental disorder, and so there's a manual in the counseling and psychology world
DSM.
called the DSM.
Yes.
We are currently in our DSM edition of 5. I happen to have a copy of this lovely book right here. This includes all of the recognized mental health disorders that we currently use to diagnose individuals. And so when someone talks about mental illness, it would be that they qualify for one of the diagnoses in here. There is some concern that not all diagnoses are properly articulated in there, or some things are kind of labeled and in a way that it pathologizes typical or a normal variation of behaviors. And so the book does not come without controversy, but when you separate mental illness from mental wellness, it's typically using the DSM criteria as the line drawn in the sand.
So should I go out and buy a DSM so that I can keep it on my bookshelf and go, oh, flip it open and try and diagnose myself?
So the
sort
first
of like WebMD.
The first thing is that the DSM is really not all that interesting to read. So you wouldn't want to read it from cover to cover to begin with. It is a manual that you use as necessary, and by you use as necessary, I mean mental health professionals, so counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, medical professionals, physicians, doctors, things like that. It's not meant to be interpreted by the general population. There's a lot that goes on in relation to that text that's learned within a counseling or a graduate program in psychology and mental health. And so we should not diagnose our friends, even as a counselor and things like that. We should not be going around diagnosing our friends and family members. It's for professional purposes only. And so common mental illnesses that are often heard about are things like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. There's bipolar 1, bipolar 2. Mood disorders in general, which are depression and bipolar, tend to be pretty prevalent. And then we have anxiety disorders, generalized anxiety, specific anxiety, as well as obsessive compulsive disorder and things like that, and things that branch out from there, such as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which we usually have some level of familiarity with, but also a lot of misunderstanding about what those diagnoses are. And so I use bipolar often as an example, that I will hear young people say, like, oh, I'm just bipolar, I have bipolar, that person is acting so bipolar, and using it as a way to describe people's behaviors that don't quite fit. And even with anxiety and depression, sometimes people will identify themselves or others as having these diagnoses, and they don't quite fit. And so I think that there's probably a lot of misunderstanding out there, which is another reason why the general average person should not just pick up the DSM and start diagnosing themselves or others, as you might do with WebMD.
Yeah. So throwing those labels or assigning those labels onto people just in regular conversation, my first thought, I had two. My first thought was, oh, well, so there's an awareness of those things, so that's a positive. And I'm like, wait a minute, no, it's not, because we're using them, one, we're using them improperly, and two, we're not usually using them kindly. Oh man, they're bipolar, and it's not usually a term of endearment. My bipolar friend. So yeah, I guess we need to be careful with throwing around those labels, because it again furthers that stigma and goes, oh man, what's wrong with me? As though there's. So that's an interesting question. So the question, what's wrong with me? So if I'm feeling, depressed or anxious or whatever, something feeling off, is there something wrong with me? Like, oh my God, there's something wrong. Oh, what am I going to do? There's something wrong with me. As opposed to like, my blood pressure is high or whatever. Can you talk about that?
So I want to back up just a little bit as far as the labeling. And so there is this growing trend. I don't know if it's growing quite as fast in general vernacular as it could or should be, but person first language. And so instead of referring to our clients as the bipolar client or the schizophrenic client, referring to them as the client that has bipolar or that has symptoms of schizophrenia. And so recognizing that the person is an individual and should be addressed as such, and not labeling them in such a way. And we often see this with young kids. They'll get labeled in a certain way, perhaps in school, and then future educators will read their records and then identify them in that way and treat them from that perspective rather than treat them as an individual. So I think that's one important thing.
So we're not our label.
Right, correct. And there are different approaches to counseling that really emphasize this. So like reality therapy, it's not, what and who you are, it's something that you're dealing with or something that you're coping with or something that you might have some symptoms of, and not seeing it as a defining characteristic of the person themselves.
Interesting. So, am I weird?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so a lot of times the question, and even to go back to the question you first asked, is, is there something wrong with me? Am I crazy? Am I weird? Those are often questions that might come up, or even about other people. Is my child X, Y, or Z? Or is my loved one, these things? And I think some of that does come from that negative stigma that has been attached to mental health and mental illness. That people make the assumption that there's something wrong or something bad or something like that, versus something that someone's trying to cope with and that they can either manage, they can adjust to, or even alleviate many of the symptoms of. And so when we look at statistics, I just want to bring it up to make sure that I'm accurately representing this. This is from the website NAMI.org, and NAMI is an organization that promotes mental health practices and counseling, and does a lot of research and work on connecting individuals who have mental illness with providers. And so their sort of tagline is "You are not alone." And so what they cite currently is that 1 in 5 U.S. adults experience mental illness. And so think about yourself and your close family members, your closest friends. At least one of you will experience mental health concerns at some point in your life. And 1 in 20 U.S. adults actually experience severe or serious mental illness. And so to differentiate between mental illness and what we consider serious or severe mental illness, that would be more pervasive and chronic. It would be conditions that we may not be able to alleviate ourselves completely of, but things that we would more learn coping strategies to deal with, or do adjustments in our life to help deal with the concerns that they create. So that would be like schizophrenic type diagnoses. It would be forms of dementia and traumatic brain injury. It could also be what are called personality disorders, so something that's a little bit more pervasive. And a statistic that I think is really important to focus on is young people. And so 17% of youth ages 6 to 17 also may experience a mental health disorder as well in their life. And so again, this is talking about something that would classify as a diagnosis, and so there are certainly more people who might experience symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety, or other concerns that may not qualify quite for a DSM diagnosis, but could still benefit from some kind of support or counseling.
Right. So how do you cope? How do you deal? What are steps? So let's go, because there's two ends, right? So the wellness, the mental wellness, and the mental illness. So diagnose mental illness. What do? How do I navigate the world and not? How do I navigate the world and be functional and whole? So I think I've heard a lot of people say, I just feel like empty, or I feel like a shell of myself, or I feel disjointed. So how do I have a diagnosable mental illness and I don't feel whole? How do I make myself feel whole?
Well, I think the one important thing to point to is sort of the way that you ask this question. So how do I make myself, right? And so there definitely is a lot of work that individuals can do, but it works best when it's supported by others. And so identifying organizations, there are a lot of local NAMI organizations and organizations like them that help promote mental wellness and treatment for mental illness. And so it's connecting with organizations like that can further connect you with counselors and treatment providers in the area, group support, group counseling, and lots of other information and things like that. And so the important thing is not to go it alone, to recognize that even if you're not sure if you have supports already in your life, people that you can go to and trust, that you can find organizations like this that will connect you to people that you can ultimately trust and get support from. It is important, like I started off saying, to recognize that going to a provider, they're not going to sort of fix all of your problems, right? Some ways people will look at mental illness as being broken and that the person ultimately needs to be fixed. And that's just not the reality. The reality is that counselors and other helpers are going to support the person and kind of act as a guide, a partner along the journey to help the person to wellness. But that the work still is inevitably that person's. And when they don't feel strong enough to do the work for themselves, they have the people there that are able to sit with them in that and help move them to that next, step to help them to get back on the path again. And so I think that that's one of the biggest things is being able to connect, being able to find help and support and not feel embarrassed or vulnerable or scared to ask for it, to be able to go out there and do it. And I think that the stigma is a lot of what makes people afraid. It's a lot of what prevents people from reaching out for help. The idea that this person is going to think those things about me. I'm crazy. There's something wrong with me. And so helping as a society, as a community, to alleviate or decrease or even completely diminish that stigma is going to be hugely impactful in helping people to be able to reach out and be willing to reach out to others.
Yeah, and I'm not sure we always react properly or know how to react. So you have someone who's going through, whether it's diagnosable depression or whatever, but they're struggling. They're struggling. It's obvious, but we don't always know how to engage, because things like, oh, it'll be okay. Just get a good night's sleep and it'll all be better. Sleep helps. Like, sleep legitimately helps everything, but it doesn't cure everything. So, and we often also often have these platitudes that we say, not just around mental illness, but around mental illness as well. Tomorrow will be it's okay, or all of those things. And to that person, things clearly aren't. So I think we often lack, people with good intentions often lack the skills or the language to help those they care about in the storm, in the mess of whatever's going on. And sometimes, I think you mentioned this a minute ago, sometimes it's not about what you say, it's just being present. Like, just listening. Not one of my strengths. I tend to talk a lot. But I mean, just being present and listening can be hugely helpful. And, I see it in ministry a lot when someone dies. They're in a better place. And it's like, wait a minute, my spouse or my kid or my mom or my dad or whoever just died, and you're saying, oh, it'll be right, they're in a better place. It's not what I want to hear. Like, I'm grieving here. Like, so I mean, how do we? Is there a skill to say, listen, just do this? Is it just being present and listening, as opposed to saying something? Because we all want to say or do something to help. Like, I think most people in the world have this desire to help or want to help. We don't like to see our loved ones, suffering or in pain. A couple months ago, Christina was like stressed out because she would like have grading to do. I have this. I said, listen, I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm watching you drown and I can't help you and I don't know what to do. And I probably said some things that weren't helpful from the right place. And I think that it's often we say things from the right place. They're just not always what someone needs to hear or helpful at the time.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. That I think that for the most part people are well intentioned and they really want to make things better for other people. I don't want to see you suffer. I don't want to see you in pain, and so I want to do, kind of pull at straws to figure out what it is I can do to somehow make this better, and I feel so limited in my ability to do that. And so they turn to platitudes, like you said, of like, things will get better, and like quotes and, things like that. And even, oh yeah, there was a time in my life that I was kind of struggling, so I'm going to offer you all this advice about things that I did. And that may not be helpful for the other person. And so in truth, just being there, being present, sometimes not even talking, just being silent. Sometimes physical connection, hugging, holding hands, things like that is what the person needs. Sometimes it's an ear to listen and not to talk, not to give that advice, not to say those platitudes, but just to hear them out, and then be able to use those active listening skills, right, that we rarely ever use, being able to, nod our head, give eye contact, express a level of understanding to the other person that, I see you. I see what you're going through. And I may not be able to understand it for myself. Maybe I've never experienced something like that. But I'm understanding where you're coming from. I'm doing the best that I can to understand this place that you're at. Sometimes that can be more than enough, because ultimately we don't want everyday people to try and become like armchair experts of psychology and counseling. That's not what you're trained to do if that's not what you're trained to do. And so just being there, being present for the people, and also maybe offering to help them with some of those supports, right? Like, hey, I heard of this organization, NAMI, let's look it up and see if there's a local chapter. I have a friend who is a counselor, so let me contact them and ask if they have some referrals in the area that you might be able to connect to a counselor that, takes your insurance or is low cost. And so being able to also kind of maybe walk with that person on their journey, but not doing the work for them and not offering them these like false kind of promises of tomorrow will be better and everything will be okay, because frankly we don't know that. We don't know that tomorrow will be better, and we don't know that everything will be okay.
As much as we want it to be. Mm-hmm. So what about just general wellness? Like, how can we try and cut off falling into depression or whatever? How can we? Because if we can prevent it, which isn't, our society is not good at preventative medicine, right? Like, we don't talk about the preventative side because, frankly, I think economically it's better economically for the economic system to have sick people, because then we can charge and make money off of it. Not that there's not money to be made in prevention, but I think there's more to be made in illness. But preventative measures, how can we make sure that we're tuned up, to use like a car analogy?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things to say to that, and a couple of complications as well. So the first thing is that stigma often prevents people from getting help when they have even a diagnosable mental illness. However, it also can prevent people who are maybe only having a few symptoms get help as well, because they think, oh, counseling is for crazy people, or I don't have it quite as bad as other people, and so I don't need that support or can't use that support. And so it, I think, adds to people not getting that preventative help and not reaching out until it gets really bad. And so often, I know I'm not alone in this experience, clients will come to me and say, I've been dealing with this for a year or 2 years or 10 years or all my life. And it's like, well, why didn't you come in sooner? And it's because, I didn't think it was that bad, or I thought that other people had it worse, or people told me, oh, you can't go into counseling, you're not crazy like that, it's not that bad. And so there's a lot of that. But I also think, you brought up the economic piece, and there's also this issue with mental illnesses. Diagnosable mental illnesses can be covered under insurance payments, but mental wellness is not. And so just as you might go to...
That's my point.
Right. Just as you might go to your physician, your medical physician, for a wellness check and the insurance covers it. That doesn't happen with counseling. And so people can't have their sessions covered by insurance unless I give them a diagnosis. And obviously it is unethical to give someone a diagnosis that they don't qualify for, that they don't truly hit the necessary requirements for it. And then that person is left in a situation of, I'm struggling. It's not so bad. I could imagine it being worse, but I am struggling, but I can't get help because it's not going to be paid for. And do I use money, because counseling can be expensive, to pay for these counseling services, or do I use it for these other things that might be necessary? And it really puts people in a position where they let those issues go untreated because they just can't afford to get them treated. And also kind of following up with some stigma is that if you do diagnose a person with a mental illness, and especially if you go the route of like, well, I'm going to kind of stick them in this diagnosis so that their insurance covers it, which again is unethical, it creates a situation where yes, their treatment is being covered. Great for the client, right? But it's also attaching a diagnosis to them that potentially could follow them for the rest of their life. And with the way society is with mental illness and mental health stigma, that person could be stigmatized. There could be people who find out about that diagnosis and treat them in a different way, or ultimately discriminate against them because they've had that diagnosis. And so it does create a lot of concerns for people to engage in those preventative measures.
So it's not like a kind of sort of bipolar in the DSM. It's either, I mean, you have this ailment or you don't.
Mm-hmm. And again, insurance companies not covering preventative appointments creates that issue where a diagnosis has to be given for coverage.
Yeah.
And there are even some diagnoses in the DSM that insurance still don't cover because they don't consider it to be concerning enough, which is a whole nother issue in and of itself.
Right. So we originally sort of broached this topic on the more the individual and the personal level, but there's actually a systemic issue with insurance and things like that that feed into not just the personal, but it's just layers on top of it.
Right. There were a lot of issues compounded. Like we talked about society stigma. We talked about different identities like religious and cultural identities, and also insurance companies. And so another example of insurance companies is that, in some cases, insurance companies have been able to deny people coverage because of pre-existing conditions. And so if you've had a mental health diagnosis, that could be considered a pre-existing condition. And insurance coverage can deny you services because of that. Again, right now, with the Affordable Care Act, that has been somewhat taken care of, but of course there could be lots of changes in insurance and laws and things like that, just as there have been in the past. And so there are so many structures at play that are really impacting the ability for people, again, to get those preventative services and to even get the treatment that they need for the mental illness that they may have.
So so there's a whole advocacy piece to this beyond the care for yourself, care for your loved ones, but a whole advocacy piece to care for society in general that I think makes society healthier if we're able to break the systems that don't pay for insurance or don't cover. I hate insurance. Like, insurance is like the biggest Ponzi scheme. Like, so you pay money.
If you're our insurance cover broker, don't listen to this.
If you're an insurance company, please hit pause and forward till I'm done my rant. But it is really frustrating. So, I pay in, $100, random number. I pay in $100, and then I go to use my insurance, and then they try to tell me why I can't claim, which is, I'm paying for this service, and then you're actively, instead of providing that service, telling me why that you shouldn't have to pay for that service. Mm-hmm. It's a brilliant Ponzi scheme, people. Like, but again, the way our system is set up,
it's necessary because individuals who don't have insurance coverage,
right.
One thing happens and they can go bankrupt. They can completely go broke. They might lose their job or lose their house, because of a medical issue. And, it is necessary in those situations. And so talk a little bit more about the advocacy and kind of community care piece. We talk a lot, I think, in general as a society, but definitely in the counseling field about self-care. But we need to also look at community care. How are we caring for all individuals in the community and not just ourselves? And so what are we doing to, engage in preventative efforts at schools, in, religious organizations, in community centers, and all of that? And I think that, this is another topic that we might get into at a different point, but when we look at the political system, often people will say, I don't get political, or I don't like to get involved in political issues, but really everything is a political issue, right? If there are laws going into place that will help benefit people who are struggling with mental health issues, or even, might offer coverage for preventative services, we want to advocate for that. We want to be able to talk to our lawmakers and say, yes, this is a good idea. This is a good use of our money. So that, maybe I may never need it, but other people in the community may need it. And so being able to stand up for the people who may not be able to stand up for themselves, or stand with the people who are out there advocating for themselves. And so I think community care is a really important factor.
That sounds really Jesus-y.
Yeah, you'd think that it was something that maybe he himself promoted. Yeah. So one of the things I love about ministry is also one of the most frustrating things about ministry. I'm a firm believer that as people of faith, as the church, we are called to advocate and help those who are in need, and sometimes those are. That means we have to address unpleasant truths that maybe are convicting to my lifestyle, my way of life, the things I like, the people I vote for. Jesus wasn't Republican or Democrat, but Jesus was definitely political. I mean, Jesus doesn't die if there's not a political force that puts him on the cross. So, right. So when people say, "Oh, I keep my religion and my politics separate," then you're not really talking about religion in any way other than your own personal faith. And faith isn't meant to be personal. Faith is meant to be communal. So there's that whole thing. That's probably another video that probably gets me in a lot of trouble. But hey. Wouldn't be the first time. Right, and that's really looking at Christianity, but even when you broaden the view to other world religions and spiritual practices, really in general, I would say that most, definitely not going to say all, but most really advocate for community care, caring for one another, supporting future generations, taking care of the older generations, and even taking it further to say caring for the world and nature and the environment that we're in. And so, really regardless of what religious doctrine you practice or spiritual practice you're involved in, there's going to be some component of that. That taking care of ourselves and taking care of others is an important call that we have as humans. Yeah, it's a common thread throughout all the major religions. It's that care for community, care for one another. And sometimes in our individualistic society, especially in American culture, we struggle with that. We struggle with the whole idea of caring for other people. Not that we don't care specifically about other people, but if we know them, it's easier to care for them. I think it's harder when we don't know the person and it's the concept. Most people, well, of course I'll do something for my family and my friends. But will you do something for the guy you don't know and the guy you might never meet? That's what we're really talking about. Okay, so I don't have mental illness, or my family doesn't experience mental illness, but I know that in society it's an issue. How can we advocate that they're cared for? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and taking it a step further, which again can be a whole nother topic in and of itself, but mental illness tends to be highly pervasive in marginalized communities. And so communities that have less power and privilege in our society are more likely to struggle because either they don't have the insurance coverage, or even if they have the insurance coverage, it doesn't cover all the services that they need, or they don't have the finances to get the support they need because there just isn't enough money to care for their individual or their family, let alone these additional things, or there's limitations to their ability to work or the types of jobs they might have because of mental illness, and also because of their identities being limited options and opportunities because of that. And so these communities need everyone's help to advocate for more equitable care, because, again, can kind of go off on another topic, but if the marginalized communities are the only ones advocating for themselves, they are going to get burnout, even more burnout than they already are, facing the challenges that they may be facing. And so when you are able to identify yourself as having a privileged identity, in what ways can you use that privilege to benefit others? And so maybe in some ways it might be benefiting your other identities, right? So maybe you have certain levels of privilege in some way. So for example, I am well educated, I'm financially, doing well, I am a white person, Christian, mainstream religion, but I'm also a female. And so, if I want to advocate for gender equity and equality, well, I can also be advocating for, other religions and other ethnicities and racial identities and all of that, because equality for one is potentially equality for all. And so, how can we make sure that we're going out there and taking care of communities? And in this case, we're talking specifically about those who have mental illness, even if, like Chad said, we have never dealt with that ourselves, and maybe we might not even know someone in our immediate circle who has, but just for the betterment of community overall.
There's a really good book I'm reading right now called Black Fatigue, and it talks about, just obviously it talks through a racial lens, not a mental health lens. Although there is a chapter on black fatigue and the health effects, and some of that being mental health. And the book is really good at unpacking all the layers that I'll speak for myself as a person of privilege, male, hetero, Christian, white, all those things that, are kind of top of the privilege food chain, if you will. And this book does a really good job of unpacking all the layers and all the things that I don't have to think about. And it's forced me to think about them. And in terms of this mental health piece, I again, unpack it. We all, 1 in 5 was the stat, right? So we all know someone, whether it's us individually or our immediate family, we all know 5 people. Statistically speaking, you go to dinner with 10 of your friends, sit around the table. Now, don't sit around the table and go, oh, I bet it's John, or I bet it's Susie. Don't do that. But I mean, you go out to dinner with 10 people, 2 of those people, statistically speaking, have a mental illness. Mm-hmm.
And so when you are gathered with people and you're talking to friends, family, or maybe even just acquaintances or people you just meet, the more that we talk about mental illness in a destigmatizing way, the more likely those people who might be struggling in silence will start to speak up, because they're going to feel like this is a safe place. If you never bring up mental health ever in conversation with another individual, they are probably not going to bring it up to you when they're struggling, because they're not going to be sure if it's a safe place to do so. And so the more that we can normalize it and destigmatize it, the more comfortable people are going to be to speak up and maybe ask for that help, or you're going to recognize, oh, I never knew that person, was feeling that way. Often mental health diagnoses are called invisible illnesses, because it's something that you can't always tell by looking at a person or looking, from the outside. You have to kind of have an understanding of what's going on in the inside, and they may not be sharing it because of fear of, those labels and things like that. And so, the more that we talk about it in very open and healthy ways, the more likely other people are going to come to us or even reach out for the help that they might need, rather than suffer in silence.
Yeah, I made a comment a few months ago about having a counseling appointment. Somebody looked at me, "Oh, you go to counseling?" And you don't need to diagnose me. Well, he's not on here. But it was kind of like, oh, I said, hey, I got a lot of shit going on, and it opened up another conversation that wouldn't have otherwise been opened. And I'm generally not all that guarded, but just that one, oh, sorry, I can't have a counseling appointment that day. Oh, and then it opened up a whole other line of conversation that wouldn't have been opened, and hopefully on some level, it may have stigmatized me, who knows, but hopefully destigmatizes the idea that it's the crazy person on the street, or it's people in everyday life, and it's not always debilitating. I think that's the other piece. You talked about the invisible illness. If someone has a broken leg, you see the cast. Those sorts of things that you can visibly see. This is something you can't. And there are a lot of people. There are a lot of people in our lives that go about their day-to-day work, and you would have no idea. I just was made aware of an instance where, found out someone drinks heavily at night. Gets up in the morning, goes to work, goes about their business. You'd have no clue. That night, a significant drinking problem. But on the surface, you have no idea.
Yeah, and so I think, one of the big takeaways can be the idea of making the invisible visible, giving it space and giving it room, so that it can come out in the open, and we can have honest and frank conversations about it. We can get people the support, get ourselves the support that we might need, and sort of stop putting it in a closet or hiding it away, which are some of the same things that have been done historically to individuals who have mental illness. Let's hide them away. Let's send them off. Lock them in hospitals. And that's just, we can, for the most part, agree that that's inhumane. And so why do we continue the practice of allowing it to just be individual? Maybe we should start seeing that as inhumane as well.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm. Any last thoughts?
No, I don't think so. I hope that in some way we've destigmatized it and at least brought it out. Maybe it's a conversation you all have around the dinner table or over a drink, or whatever, with your family, with your kids, and recognize that some of it does involve some vulnerability. To be vulnerable enough to say, hey, I can't have a counselor. I could have very easily said, yeah, I can't, I'm busy for that at that time, or I have an appointment at that time. It's it takes some vulnerability to take that next step and say, I have a counseling appointment at that time, or even to just simply say, I'm really struggling right now. And I think if we can just be a little more gracious to one another as a society, that we're more comfortable being vulnerable, I think that can help break some of the stigma, because we're then willing to share things and be more vulnerable than we'd otherwise be willing to share when people are not so kind. That's all I got.
Yeah, and so if you have any thoughts, feedback, questions about the episode today or any of our other episodes, feel free to contact us at the emails that you see on the screen. As part of sort of shameless self-promotion, if you want to have a conversation with someone about mental health and wellness, share this episode with them. Share it on social media. And if you're inclined to do so, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and like our content, get it out there. If you have ideas for the show, or if you're interested in joining us for one of these conversations, either in person or we can definitely do it remote, let us know that as well.
Bye, everybody.
Be well.